Back. Get ready, because today um, we are diving deep into the world of Expressionism.
Ah, Expressionism is such a fascinating movement, you know?
It really is, and I think what makes it so interesting is it's not just about pretty pictures.
No, not at all.
It's about feeling.
It's about emotion.
Yeah, it's art that hits you right in the gut.
It's raw, it's unfiltered, it's powerful, and you know what else is fascinating? The historical context.
Yeah, this is where it gets really interesting because,
Picture Europe in the early 1900s, rapid industrialization cities bursting at the seams, a looming sense of unease.
it was a time of massive upheaval, and
All of this fueled this generation of artists who wanted to express something deeper, something beyond the surface of everyday life.
it was like they were holding a mirror up to all these anxieties.
No,
But
instead of a reflection, you get this explosion of color and distorted forms. It's really something.
yeah, and it's not just one style either, right? We've got,
That's right. We have two main branches of Expressionism.
okay, so tell me about them.
So we have Die Brücke, which means the bridge, and Der Blaureiter, which means the blue rider.
Okay, two groups, two names that sound like they belong in a fantasy novel.
I know, right? But they represent really distinct approaches to Expressionism.
Okay, so what's the difference? Like, how can we tell them apart?
Well, Die Brücke was all about bridging the gap between the past and the present.
Okay.
They were looking back at older art forms, especially medieval German art, and trying to find ways to make them relevant to modern life.
So, like, taking something old and rough around the edges and giving it a modern twist.
Exactly. And they were particularly drawn to the energy and anxieties of city life.
Yeah.
You know, crowded streets, bustling nightclubs.
That makes sense. The city was this.
A sense of both excitement and alienation.
Yeah, a symbol of the modern age.
You see it all there in their paintings.
Okay, so that's Die Brücke, the bridge builders.
Mm.
What about Der Blaureiter? Were they hanging out in the city too, or were they off on a different journey?
Definitely a different path. They were less about the physical world and more about the spiritual realm.
Interesting.
Symbolism, deep emotion, even a push towards abstraction. That's where their focus was.
So while Die Brücke was capturing the grid of the city, Der Blaureiter was looking inward, exploring the soul.
You got it. And to really appreciate both of these branches, we need to get familiar with some of the big names in Expressionism.
Okay, hit me with them.
We've got Edvard Munch.
Oh, the master of angst.
Then there's Wassily Kandinsky, who basically rode that blue rider straight into abstract art.
Oh, Kandinsky, love his work.
And of course, we can't forget Ernst Ludwig Kirchner, who captured the pulse of urban life like no other.
And I'm guessing no Expressionism conversation is complete without mentioning Egon Schiele.
You know, his work could make even the most seasoned art critic blush.
Okay, so those are some names to remember. But before we get into the specifics of each artist, I want to understand what made Expressionism so visually distinct.
Yes, the visual language of Expressionism, it's so unique.
And for me, it's those intense, sometimes jarring colors.
Oh, absolutely. Color plays a huge role in Expressionism. Think shocking reds, unnatural greens.
Yeah, it's not exactly a calming palette. Right.
Not at all. They weren't trying to mimic reality. They used color to evoke emotion, to create a psychological impact on the viewer.
So instead of painting a green tree, they might paint it purple, if that's what the feeling of the tree called for.
Exactly. It's like they were saying, forget about what a tree should look like. Let me show you what it feels like.
I love that. And then there are those brushstrokes, thick, bold, almost violent at times.
Ah, yes. The brushstroke's another hallmark of Expressionism. They wanted you to see the process, the raw emotion behind each stroke.
Yeah, it's like each brushstroke is a burst of feeling.
A direct line to the artist's soul.
Exactly. And of course, we can't forget the distortion of form. The figures, the objects, they're often twisted, elongated, bent out of shape.
That's right. They weren't afraid to break away from those classical ideals of beauty and proportion.
It's like looking at the world through a funhouse mirror where everything is slightly offing. A bit unsettling.
Exactly. And that was intentional. They wanted to convey the inner turmoil, the anxieties of modern life. And sometimes that meant distorting reality to get the point across.
It's like they were saying, look, the world's a bit messy right now, and we're not going to shy away from that.
Precisely. They embraced the messiness, the chaos, the raw emotions of the human experience, and they weren't afraid to put it all out there on the canvas.
And that's what makes Expressionism so powerful and so relevant even today.
Absolutely. It's a movement that still speaks to us on a visceral level.
So
It challenges us to confront our own emotions
to see the world.
in a new light.
All right, so we've got the emotional landscape, those bold visuals, and two intriguing groups to explore. Let's start with Die Brücke. What were they trying to bridge exactly?
Think of it this way. They were trying to bridge the gap between traditional art and the chaotic, exhilarating energy of modern life. They saw beauty in the grit of the city, in the faces of everyday people, even in the darker aspects of human
But
experience.
not just painting pretty landscapes anymore, but diving headfirst into the urban jungle.
Exactly. And remember their fascination with medieval German art. That primitive aesthetic, as it's called, was all about raw, unfiltered expression,
Hmm.
a kind of artistic rawness that they felt resonated with the modern experience. They saw a connection between those medieval woodcuts and the energy of the city, a shared sense of intensity and emotional directness.
Fascinating. So they were kind of like urban anthropologists, but with paintbrushes instead of notebooks.
That's a great analogy. And their manifesto, written in 1906, really captures their rebellious spirit. It was a call to action, urging young artists to break free from the constraints of tradition and embrace a new, more expressive art form.
Sounds like they were shaking things up. Okay, let's cross that bridge, shall we? Tell us about Der Blaureiter. What was with their fascination with blue and why a writer?
For Der Blau Reiter Blue held a deep symbolic meaning. It represented spirituality transcendence, a kind of escape from the material world, and the writer. Think of it as a symbol of moving forward, venturing into the unknown realms of emotion and spirituality.
Okay, so while Deep Brick was all about that gritty urban realism, Der Blaureiter was looking for something more mystical, something beyond the everyday.
Exactly. And they found it in the expressive power of color form and symbolism. One of the most famous blue writer artists, Franz Marc, believed that animals held a special spiritual significance. He often painted horses, deer, and birds, seeing them as symbols of a pure instinctual connection to nature.
It's amazing how both groups, while responding to the same historical context, found such different ways to express themselves. It's like they were looking at the same world through different lenses, one focused on the external, the other on the internal.
That's a brilliant observation. And it's that tension between the physical and the spiritual, between the external world and the inner landscape, that makes Expressionism so compelling.
All right, let's put some faces to these movements.
Yeah.
We mentioned Munch earlier, what makes him the poster child for Expressionism.
Well, his iconic painting, The Scream, is pretty much the embodiment of existential angst. That distorted figure with hands clasped to their head, that swirling blood red sky. It captures a feeling of overwhelming anxiety that resonates with people even today.
It's like a visual representation of a panic attack, and I bet everyone's felt something similar at some point in their lives.
Exactly. It's that raw emotional honesty that makes Munch's work so powerful. And what's interesting is that The Scream wasn't just an imagined scene. Munch described a real experience where he felt a wave of anxiety wash over him, seeing the sky turn red as if nature itself was screaming.
Wow, talk about art imitating life. And then we have Kandinsky, the guy who took that Blue Rider all the way into abstract territory. What was he trying to achieve with those swirling colors and non-representational forms?
Kandinsky believed that art should transcend the physical world and speak directly to the soul. He saw color as having its own inherent spiritual vibrations, and he used it to create compositions that were less about depicting objects and more about evoking emotions and spiritual experiences. His painting, Der Blaureiter, which gave the movement its name, is a perfect example of this approach. You can almost feel the energy and movement in those abstract forms, like a visual representation of music.
So while Munch was capturing those raw, almost painful emotions, Kandinsky was looking for a way to escape them, to find solace in a realm beyond the material world.
That's a great way to put it. And his use of color was absolutely crucial to that endeavor. He assigned specific spiritual meanings to different colors. Blue represented spirituality, yellow symbolized joy, green stood for peace, and so on. He believed that by carefully arranging these colors, he could create visual harmonies that would resonate with the viewer's soul.
Okay, we've got the angst and the spiritual seeker. What about Kirchner? How did his work capture that urban energy we were talking about?
Kirchner's Berlin street scenes are like snapshots of a city on the verge of a nervous breakdown. The figures are often angular and distorted, the colors clash and vibrate, the perspectives are skewed, creating a sense of movement and unease.
It's like the city itself is pulsating with a kind of manic energy.
And he wasn't afraid to show the darker side of urban life either. He painted prostitutes, marginalized figures, scenes that hinted at the moral decay and social anxieties lurking beneath the surface of the booming metropolis.
So while Kandinsky was seeking solace in the spiritual realm, Kirchner was confronting the realities of modern life head-on, capturing all the beauty and ugliness of the city.
You nailed it. And that brings us to Egon Schiele, the ultimate provocateur. His work is not for the faint of heart.
Oh man, Sheila, yeah, his work is intense.
Yeah.
But, before we dive into the more, let's say, provocative side of Expressionism, I want to circle back to those two branches we were talking about.
Yes, Die Brücke and Der Blaureiter, two sides of the same coin, really.
Right. So we left off with Die Brücke, those bridge builders who were all about connecting the past to the present.
Exactly. They saw this link between the raw energy of medieval German art and the chaotic vibrancy of modern city life.
Yeah, and it's funny because when you think about it, those medieval woodcuts, they have this almost primal quality to them, right? Like they're so direct and unfiltered.
Absolutely, and that's exactly what Die Brücke was drawn to. They wanted to strip away all the pretense, all the polish of traditional art, and get back to that raw emotional core.
So it's not just about the subject matter, it's about the way they approach the act of creation itself.
Exactly. And that's reflected in their manifesto, too. That call to action they wrote in 1906?
Oh yeah, tell me about that.
Well, it was basically a rallying cry for young artists. They were urging them to break free from the constraints of the art academies to embrace a new, more expressive and rebellious art form.
Wow, so they were like the punk rockers of the art world.
I love that, Anxiji. They were definitely shaking things up and challenging the status quo.
So that's Die Brücke, the bridge builders, the rebels, the urban explorers. What about Der Blaureiter? They were a different breed, right?
Oh, yeah, they were on a whole other journey. They were less interested in the external world and more fascinated by the internal, the spiritual, the mystical.
Right, and we were talking about their fascination with the color blue. What was that all about?
Well, for Der Blaureiter, blue symbolized spirituality transcendence, a kind of escape from the material world. It represented a deeper, more profound reality beyond the everyday.
And then there's the rider. What's the significance of that?
The writer symbolized a journey, a movement towards the unknown, towards those deeper realms of emotion and spirituality. It's like they were riding into the depths of the human soul.
I love that imagery. You mentioned one of the key figures in Der Blaureiter, Franz Marc, who was obsessed with animals. What was his deal?
Franz Marc. He believed that animals possessed a kind of spiritual purity that humans had lost touch with. He saw them as symbols of a connection to nature, to a more primal and authentic way of being.
So he wasn't just painting pretty pictures of animals. He was trying to capture something deeper, something about the essence of life itself.
Exactly. He saw animals as a way to tap into a more spiritual and intuitive understanding of the world. And his paintings often have this incredible sense of movement and energy, like the animals are about to leap off the canvas.
And it's funny because both Die Brücke and Der Blaureiter, they were responding to the same historical context, the same anxieties and upheavals of the early 20th century. But they found such different ways to express those anxieties.
It's true. It's like they were looking at the same world through different lenses. Daybrooke focused on the external, the grit and chaos of the modern city, while Der Blaureiter looked inward, searching for meaning and solace in the spiritual realm.
It's that tension between the physical and the spiritual, the external and the internal, that makes Expressionism so fascinating and so enduring.
Absolutely. It's a movement that speaks to the very core of the human experience, to our need to make sense of the world around us and to find our place within it.
And speaking of finding our place in the world, let's talk about Edvard Munch, one of the most iconic figures in Expressionism. His work is so raw and so emotionally charged, it's hard to look away.
Oh, Edvard Munch, he's the master of angst, the painter of existential dread. His work just cuts right to the heart of human vulnerability and alienation.
Yeah, Munch, he really gets to you, doesn't he? It's like he's tapping into some deep primal fear that we all share.
He really does. And speaking of primal fears, let's talk about Egon Schiele. Now his work is intense.
Oh, yeah. Schiele definitely pushes the boundaries.
Yeah.
But what made him so controversial? Like, what set him apart from other expressionists?
Well, Schiele was obsessed with the human body, but not in a classical, idealized way.
Right, it's not like those Renaissance nudes you see in museums.
No, not at all. His figures are raw, often grotesque. Their poses are contorted, angular, almost painful to look at.
It's like he's intentionally trying to make us uncomfortable.
He is. He wasn't afraid to explore themes of sexuality, desire, and mortality, even when those themes made people squirm.
So while other artists were painting landscapes and portraits, Schiele was diving headfirst into the messy, complicated world of human flesh and emotion.
Exactly. And he did it with a raw, unflinching honesty that shocked many people at the time.
Yeah, I can see why his work was considered scandalous back then.
Imagine those elongated limbs, those haunting eyes, those intensely expressive faces. It's like he was stripping away all pretense and revealing the raw nerves of human existence.
Like he's forcing us to confront our own mortality, our own physicality.
Absolutely. And that's what makes Schiele's work so powerful and so unsettling. It's a reminder that beneath all the social conventions and facades, we're all just flesh and bone subject to the same desires and anxieties.
So in a way, he's the ultimate expressionist, right? He's taking that idea of raw emotional honesty to its absolute extreme.
I think you're right. And it's amazing how this movement, which emerged over a century ago, still feels so relevant today.
It really does. It's like those anxieties, those existential questions that inspired the expressionists, they haven't gone away. They've just morphed and taken on new forms.
Exactly. And I think that's why Expressionism continues to resonate with us. It speaks to something fundamental about the human condition, something that transcends time and place.
And speaking of transcending time and place, we can't wrap up our expressionism deep dive without talking about its impact on other art forms.
Ah, yes, the ripple effect of Expressionism.
Because it wasn't just confined to painting, right? It influenced music, theater, film, even architecture.
Absolutely. It's like this explosion of creative energy that spilled over into every artistic domain.
So give me some examples.
Mhm.
How did expressionism influence, let's say, music?
Well, think of composers like Arnold Schoenberg. He completely abandoned traditional harmony and tonality, creating music that was jarring, dissonant, and emotionally intense.
Oh yeah, Schoenberg, he's not exactly easy listening.
No, he's not. But his music reflects that same sense of anxiety and fragmentation that you see in Expressionist painting. It's a rejection of the old rules, a search for new ways to express the complexities of modern life.
So it's like those clashing colors and distorted forms found their equivalent in the world of sound.
Exactly. And then you have playwrights like Bertolt Brecht who used expressionistic techniques in the theater. Think stark lighting, distorted sets, and exaggerated acting styles, all designed to break the illusion of realism and confront the audience with social and political issues.
So it's like they were using the stage to hold a mirror up to society's ills.
Precisely. And of course, we can't forget about film. Expressionism had a huge impact on cinema, especially in Germany.
Oh yeah. Those German expressionist films are so visually striking and so psychologically disturbing.
Think of films like The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari with its twisted sets and nightmarish
It's
visuals.
like stepping into a dream or maybe a nightmare.
Exactly. Those films use dramatic lighting, distorted perspectives, and exaggerated acting to create a world that was both visually stunning and psychologically unsettling. They tapped into those same anxieties and dark undercurrents of the human psyche that the Expressionist painters were exploring.
Wow, it's like expressionism provided a whole new visual vocabulary for filmmakers to explore the darker side of human nature.
And that influence continues to ripple through film history, inspiring genres like horror and film noir with their signature dark atmospheric visuals.
It's incredible to think how one movement sparked such a chain reaction of creativity across so many different art forms.
And it all comes back to that core idea of expressing raw emotion, of challenging conventions, of not being afraid to explore the darker, more unsettling aspects of human experience.
And that's a good reminder for all of us, right? Whether we're artists or just art enthusiasts.
Absolutely. Expressionism teaches us to embrace the messiness of life, to confront our fears and anxieties, and to find beauty in the unexpected.
It's a reminder that art can be a powerful tool for self-discovery and for connecting with others on a deeper level.
So the next time you're feeling lost or overwhelmed, or just a little bit off kilter,
Remember the expressionists.
and let their art be your guide.
That's a great note to end on. So to all our listeners out there, go explore the world of expressionism and see what emotions it stirs up in you.
And don't be afraid to let those emotions out.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into expressionism.
Until next time, keep exploring and keep expressing